Welcome to the Football Pod. My name is Konstantin Eckner, and please welcome my co-host, Abel Mezaros.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for following us. Thanks for the great feedback that we had on the episode with Grant Wall. And, I want to bring you these kind of shows where we talk about the people that influence football, the people that shape the game that we like, and want to give you them in a long-form conversation podcast. I hope you're excited just as much as I am, Konstantin.
Absolutely. I'm really excited about this new project, and I'm also very thankful. We are thankful to those who have listened to our first show with Grant Wall and those who are now listening for the first time. Really thankful to you guys. If you want to find our show on the platforms, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and even on YouTube. Just search for the Football Pod. And if you want to support us, please visit patreon.com/thefootballpod.
What do we got today? Who's our guest today? I think we have somebody who's really, really exciting. Why don't you introduce him to us, Konstantin?
Well, you're right. Once again, we have a really exciting guest. He is, I believe, a true icon of football journalism and a main pillar of ESPN's football coverage. It is none other than Gabriele Marcotti. So, Gabriele, maybe you can talk a little bit about the show you do with Julien Laurens, the Gab Juls show on ESPN that's broadcasting there. What's the idea behind it? Is it kind of like the football version of Undisputed, or what do you want to do with the show?
So the genesis was, well, obviously I guess this is really going to date me and show how old I am. But before I joined ESPN, I did a podcast for the Times of London. In fact, it was one of the few things where I kind of started it, in the sense that nobody was really podcasting much back in 2006, I think it was. And so a colleague of mine, Guillaume Balaguer, we went to our boss and said, hey, what if we do this? I'm like, what's a podcast? It's like a radio show, and you listen to it on your back then it was on your iPod. What's an iPod? It's one of those things, right? But I'm very grateful that my bosses there embraced it. And so I did it for a long time, built up an audience. And so, ESPN asked me, can you do a podcast with us now? And one of the things I don't like about podcasts, and I don't like about radio. I've worked in radio a lot here in England, both at TalkSport and then at 5 Live, is I don't like this idea of, now let's turn to our German football expert, Mr. So-and-so, usually Ralph Honigstein. And he's like, and so blah, blah, blah. And then he talks for 5 minutes, and I said, move on. Now let's go and talk to, our Newcastle expert. And there's no freaking discussion. And the basis of the podcast is there is enough of a common currency of sport that hopefully most of our listeners watch, and that the host should be able to talk to. So when I was at the Times, we generally focused on the Big Six, not because I don't care about the rest of football, but because that's kind of, everybody has an opinion everybody has a general sense of what's happening to Manchester United or Arsenal. And one of the great luxuries of being able to do it with Julien Laurens, who's somebody who covers football across Europe, is, he knows what's going on at these clubs because he watches them and he follows them. It's not rocket science. It's Barcelona, it's Bayern, it's Juve, it's United, it's City, it's whatever. So the idea is to provide kind of a one-stop shop for somebody who maybe doesn't know what happened in the weekend or midweek, somebody who values our opinions, but also somebody who can relate to it, somebody who's not being talked to by, the wise man on the radio who is the expert of this and that. And look, and some people don't like it. Some people don't like the interruptions. I've had a lot of criticism, but you know what? I find that's when I talk about football with my friends, and it's the environment I was raised in. yeah, you do get a bit heated and you do interrupt, and you don't just, sit there and be like, this is my idea. Let me talk uninterrupted for 2 minutes and now give me your idea. It's not how it works, At least not in my world. To me, that's not realistic how people talk about football.
Right. That's a good point, because like the shows that Konstantin and I have done together, and I think even some of the other ones outside of this podcast, it's there's almost like a little too much interruption. But I agree with you. Like, I think, anywhere you go, whether, from Italy to Hungary to wherever, like, if people, let's say, like, anytime, talk normally in a barber shop or wherever they talk sports, it's natural to interrupt each other. And I think TV kind of tries to capture that, but maybe podcasts can tend to be sometimes a little too polished. But obviously, yeah, you can go a lot of different ways, and that's the nice thing about it, is that you can get whatever you like.
It's a lot easier, of course, to edit a podcast, right? So sometimes you get these podcasts that are way edited. One of my favorite podcasts is it's a New York Public Radio podcast called On the Media, and they wanted this episode kind of lifting the lid on how their podcast was put together, and sort of revealing all the stuff in their conversation and interviews that they took out, which is, all the natural pauses, the repetitions, me just saying just now, and when you listen to it, yeah, it sounds great, but it's not really a discussion podcast. It's something else. And that's fine too. There's room for a lot of different types of podcasts and different manners of speaking.
Yeah, there's a lot of those kind of shows. I noticed them in football. There's a couple of those which tend to be now more like, I think when we were talking about with Grant the other day, he's going to have one about Freddie Adu that's coming out soon, and which tends to be more on the produced side. And obviously, I think like the Football Today has a lot of those, and I think those are really good as well. But it's down to what you want. But what you do is with Jules, I guess, is that sort of, as you mentioned, one-stop shop. And so want to kind of turn to some of the topics that we want to discuss today, which is something you probably will have discussed either on ESPNFC or some of the other outlets. And I think it's kind of the elephant in the room, the pandemic that's changing, football. And I mean, even this week, like we saw, like Domagoj Vida, who was playing in a friendly, and at halftime, he, or some people like realized that he was positive for COVID and had to be substituted. The Hungarian team with Marco Rossi was like last minute. It was decided that he was tested for COVID, so he had to like basically coach via like a phone. So there's like all these things you wouldn't have ever thought possible, even just like a few years ago, that you can do. And there's internationals when these players and teams are playing 3 matches in 6 days. So what's your sort of assessment right now of this pandemic and the reaction of European football in terms of even just kind of starting at the international level?
So I think the first thing to say is that, we don't know what best practice is, right? We've never been in this situation before. So any criticism, I think, has to be modulated by the fact that the governing bodies and the people who make both sporting decisions and medical decisions for us, they don't have a playbook for what is right. They've built up a bit of one because obviously this has been around, at least in Europe, since March. But it's hard to know how to proceed. It's hard to know what's right. The science keeps changing. So I think that's the first basic point. I also think, and it's difficult because I sound like a politician here, but there's competing governing bodies, right? So there's the sporting body, there's the medical protocol, there's national health authorities, there's often in many constituencies, there's local health authorities, and then there's this business with the testing. So you may be aware, for example, of cases like Achraf Hakimi, who, he tests positive for UEFA, and then he gets like 5 negative tests in a row testing for Inter. And Inter, incidentally, are using a UEFA lab to test him, right? I was talking to somebody the other day that, says that while the test is accurate, in terms of, the types of tests that they do, they give very few false negatives. In fact, they give almost zero false negatives.
Only at Bayern.
Sorry?
Only at Bayern. If you followed the ones with was it Zule, Konstantin, and who else was it? Gnabry and a couple of the other guys. Maybe Tsirkse as well. Yeah.
Whether they were false negatives?
I think there might have been false positives, but
that's what I was saying. Like you get false positives, right?
But not false negatives.
I guess what you really don't want is a false negative, right? From a public health perspective, you don't want the guy to say, "Hey, you're clear," and then he goes around and infects everybody, right? But those false positives that you mentioned at Bayern, that's an issue. It's complicated by the fact we have a case in Italy right now at Lazio, as you might have read, where they send these guys to this other lab where seemingly very few people ever test positive. And then they kind of say, oh, look, they're injured, so they don't have to take this is the allegation against them. There's both a criminal inquiry and a sporting inquiry against them. They say, well, it's an accredited lab. It's not our fault. It's a very messy situation. I look in the Premier League, right? I'm based in London. And you look at, it seems that nobody ever tests positive, right? Even we have had Kai Havertz, for example, high profile testing positive, but that was in a Champions League test. And I'm left a little bit befuddled, and I don't quite get this. And, but they're playing games. Hopefully people are staying safe. And hopefully it's not having a knock-on effect. And you kind of have to put your faith in others that people are making the right decisions.
So I guess one other thing, or one conclusion we have come to already during this pandemic, is that basically because there's a lack of stadium crowds, and because the financial models have changed, not on purpose, but just due to the fact that the pandemic has gotten a hold of football, that certainly the gap between those at the top and the rest, if it's the Premier League or even in general in the football landscape, those who are rich and those who don't have the kind of financial resources, that the gap will of course widen and will be bigger when we come out of this pandemic.
I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. That's what I thought, but having looked into it a little bit, so the teams that are hit hardest by the pandemic are teams that rely or get a higher amount of their revenue from box office, right? If you think of sort of, three large buckets of revenue that clubs get. I mean, there's actually four. One is player trading, but let's leave that to one side because that's generally nonsense. Or not nonsense, but it's more like accounting stuff. But in terms of how clubs get cash, you're talking about merchandising and sponsorship and stuff like that. And that's been hit a little bit, not that much. You're talking about broadcast revenue. And in general, you've had, rebates from broadcasters in most leagues, but hasn't been enormous. And then you've had match day income, which of course has generally gone down to zero. But that disproportionately affects clubs who had a ton of match day income. So, for example, a club like Barcelona or, I'm guessing, Schalke or Manchester United, who get big crowds, that is going to affect them a lot in terms of actually getting in cash. A club that generally gets smaller crowds, like, for example, Chelsea, because they have a smaller stadium, or maybe Bayer Leverkusen, I don't know, they're going to be less affected by it. Now, obviously, everybody's affected, right? But I think that's an important distinction to make. And I think, and the reason cash is important is, and there's a wonderful guy. He's got a Twitter account. He blogs as well, but he puts most of his data on Twitter. Named Swiss Ramble, who's definitely worth following. You guys are familiar with him, and he explains the difference between profit and cash. The way football clubs are run is cash is really important. Every euro that comes in the door generally goes back out in wages or transfers or whatever. And when that supply of cash stops, then you're in big trouble. So then you either have an owner like they had at Chelsea, or people, obviously Chelsea and Man City are the two obvious ones, because those are not just very rich owners. They're owners who have access to enormous amounts of cash and liquidity. But also other clubs, like at Milan, for example, where, the club's in a much worse financial position because of everything that happened before. But, their owner literally is a hedge fund who sits on a big pile of cash. So they can keep things going from that perspective. And I think that's been one of the single biggest differences. A club like Liverpool, where you would figure, they win the Champions League, they win the Premier League, they're growing, great commercial contracts and everything. Yeah, but they have an owner who is very much a businessman, who believes that if he has money, he needs to put his money to work rather than sitting on a pile of it. And so from a cash perspective, they're actually, very, very limited relative to other clubs. And it's a real struggle. And I think a lot of people don't seem to fully grasp that difference, which is why I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I came up with the hypothesis basically based not so much maybe if you look at let's say you compare Bayern Munich and Bayer Leverkusen, for instance. Then I totally agree. Bayer Leverkusen, small stadium, small crowds, so match day revenue isn't that large of a percentage in terms of what they have on their balance sheet. But also, I think the difference between, let's say, in some countries between the top in the league and the bottom, that the 18th or 20th team receives a disproportionately smaller amount or smaller number of television rights money. So, and sometimes match day revenue can be somewhat of an equalizer if you're a team or a club that has a large audience and a packed stadium every other Sunday or Saturday. And of course, that's now gone. But also on top, or as an addition, I think the financial gap between, let's say, in Germany, the Bundesliga and the Bundesliga 2, in terms of television rights money, or even I think in England, France, it's basically the same. So the gap is really wide. And when television rights money is the only money you get basically right now, then and that goes on for months, or I mean, we don't know, maybe a year basically. If you then we enter March or May, we don't know now, but it could be an entire year where there's almost no match day revenue in terms of ticket sales and merchandise sales in the stadium. So then I guess that the gap gets bigger because the smaller clubs or second division clubs, third division clubs, certainly they can't make up for it, and they have only the one avenue to get revenue, and but they get disproportionately smaller money than compared to the Bayern Munichs and Liverpools and so on. So I guess on an overall landscape, I think the gap could be enlarged.
I completely agree with you. And look, the gap was enormous. Was enormous to begin with and growing, right? I mean, I feel like I've written about polarization for years, and there's this thing about I'm blanking on it now, but where we kind of assume things are normal. I think the Overton window, right? Where we move the parameters of what is normal, and we think it's normal that the same teams win all the time. We think it's normal that even in England, right, where people always talk about the Premier League, about how, oh, look, it's not like Bayern or Juve win every year. And yeah, but this is a league where the gap between number 6 and number 7 in terms of resources, in terms of wage bill, is so enormous. Like number 6 being Spurs and number 7 being Everton or Leicester, probably Everton, I would guess, in terms of resources and spend and wage bill, that the only reason the top 6 don't the only area where they don't finish in the top 6 is the big 6 don't finish top 6 in a season is if they massively screw up and have to change managers or do something really, really stupid, and there's a freak occurrence. And this happens very, very rarely. Although, as we've seen, with Arsenal and United and stuff, it's happened, right, in recent years. So on the polarization aspect, let's be very clear. I'm completely with you. I think it is a huge issue for lower division clubs. And this is part of the problem. And when we talk about the landscape, we mix professional clubs where 95% of their income is match day revenue. We put them in the same conversation with Real Madrid and Manchester United and Juventus, or basically entertainment companies with a football team attached, right? They don't belong in the same conversation. Yes, it's all football. So, for example, the European Clubs Association, they put out their scenario, and look, they're certainly not conservative in making their projections, and they projected, well, we're going to lose in excess of 4 billion euros over 2 seasons. And I looked at it and I'm like, oh, wow, that's a lot of money. And then I looked at it and I'm like, well, actually, 4 billion euros in, unrealized revenue over 2 years, it's a decline of 8.9%, right? I mean, compare this to the airline industry or the hotel industry or whatever, it's not that bad. And you have a big luxury, which, and this applies to all football, that the airline industry doesn't have. 70 to 80% of your costs go in labor costs, right? To pay your players or player acquisition costs. And the great thing about players is that they don't get lifetime employment contracts. It's not like working a union job in Germany, right? I mean, at most, you're on the hook for 1, 2, 3 years. This is an industry where 25% of your workforce moves on by attrition every year because contracts expire. And on top of that, in many cases, you can also get rid of somebody if he makes too much money by finding him another club. And you even get some money back for that. Obviously, in many cases, there's players who can't shift for many reasons or whatever, right? So, I guess what I'm trying at, my sympathy for those big clubs wasn't quite so strong. And I looked at this and I said, well, maybe we need better oversight. Maybe we need to think about these business models a little bit differently. I agree with you about the lower division clubs. I think people also need to have a conversation, and I know this is not a problem in Germany, but certainly in England, do we need 130, 140 professional clubs, going right down to the conference? I appreciate the value that a club has within the community, but is my local League Two club going to have the same value to the community if I'm paying the reserve right back £300 a week or £200 a week, or even if they're semi-professional? Like, do they stop having that value that we ascribe to football? I don't know. I do hope we come out of this with better governance and better rules, and more oversight, so that these situations, don't appear again.
Yeah, I mean, like, what's interesting that when you mentioned Schalke, which is like one of the clubs that has been, almost like destroyed, certainly in a performance sense by this, because they're like 200 million in debt, and they're the ones who are losing the gate receipts, and like, which I think you're also writing in your piece, and for the big clubs it's like 3 to 5 million. I think even for Dortmund it's somewhere around that, like 4 million or so per match. And I was also thinking about some of the other leagues that maybe even not even the top 5 leagues, like a Turkish league, right, which probably doesn't do a lot of money from doesn't earn a lot of money from TV rights. I mean, typically those league rights don't cost that much, and their revenue is completely gate receipts, right? And I saw, just in terms of even the transfers they were making, it's basically a lot of those clubs are very, very cash poor, and you can see that as a result of what they do or what happens to that league, which typically has been kind of a league where you can always go to in the twilight of your career. And I think you kind of like what you saw China scaling back as well. So the 9%, which you mentioned, is staggering, but I share with you the maybe the tamed empathy towards these giant, as you call them, entertainment divisions with some footballing attached. Yeah,
I mean, again, when we talk about people who've been hit by this, and like I'm not unsympathetic to these clubs, but everybody talks about, oh, the club wants to show ambition, wants to grow, and everything, and that's great, but equally, the club, first and foremost, has to be sustainable, and it is one of the luxuries of a football club that this is a business where all the cost, like I said, almost all the cost is the players, right? If those players go away and you replace them with players who play for a lot less or even for free, everything else about the club stays the same. Everything else. The value of the club that it has within the community is still there. And I kind of want to, I always think it's something that we often forget about. There's this great line, which is actually an ad for those fancy Swiss watches, the Patek Philippe ad, where it says, I just sort of adapted it. It says like, you never actually own a football club. You simply look after it for the next generation, which I know is incredibly cheesy, but I think it applies here. What we want, what I think people should want is for clubs to survive, but not necessarily the priority should be to survive with the same quality and the same value of players that they had before. Everybody's getting hit. Clubs can adjust if there is oversight, if we have an assurance that people are following the rules, and they're not doing stuff that's dubious or getting unfair advantages, which sadly we're increasingly seeing in football. So yeah, maybe that's why I'm not as negative as some people are.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking, like, when you were mentioning these criticisms or these points, there's a lot of parallels to almost like the banking industry and like how people viewed them in light of 2008 and whatnot, and in some ways the in terms of sustainability. And I think there were also some sort of these talks about bailing out football clubs, and it's just that's a funny parallel to make. But one thing we did see is and I think probably the hardest part that us as like football fans and viewers and people who commentate on these games is the change of stadium culture. And I don't know about you, but like when I'm when I go back and watch some games, even from like a few months ago or now a year ago, now it's like weird to actually see fans in the stands. And I mean, I know some leagues, like even in Hungary, there have been matches with fans, but now it's almost weird to see fans because now you've become so used to not having them in the stadium. And so I was just wanted to get your take on whether this stadium culture now has fundamentally changed, or because right, like nothing is ever really the same once you have these unfathomable, unimaginable events take place, right? You can't really go back to the way it was before. But do you like, what sort of changes do you see or do you foresee when it comes to stadium culture? And I mean, again, we're not asking you to predict the future, but just kind of your opinion on that.
I mean, it's a great question. It's not something I thought about very much. I've been to Premier League games, without fans in these conditions, and it's pretty grim and depressing. I would hope that maybe one of the benefits of living in a digital, more connected age is that, maybe to some degree, these supporters have stayed together, not just keeping their connection with the club and following their club, but maybe with each other for the people who are members of fan groups, or maybe just people who sit together. That those relationships have continued, and that I'm hoping that when it'll be safe to return, it'll be like flipping a switch, and everybody's going to come back in. I would hate it, absolutely hate it, if the authorities took advantage of the situation to go and impose some restrictions that would further hurt fan culture. I know there's probably more of an issue in Germany, well, certainly than it is in England, where most of the grounds are just very corporate these days. But I mean, that's not something I would favor. But I hope and trust that it's not going to change so much when they return.
I mean, I was recently talking to some people, or a couple of people who are running amateur clubs in Germany, and one guy who's running his club, basically a 4th division club, out of his car dealership, which was also I don't know, was kind of cool. But he talked about how he's afraid that like people will fundamentally changed or have already changed their habits, and they won't come back after maybe the stadiums are open to fans again. And there was his fear that like now, the 50-year-old dad with his 15-year-old son, they do something else on Sundays, and they won't come back once they could come back. And you in a way you already saw that. I was watching a Wolfsburg match, a Bundesliga match, and they were allowed to have 6,000 fans in the stadium, but they only sold 4,000 and something tickets. So
yeah, but there's a global pandemic.
Of course.
I mean, I don't. I mean, I've heard people say that. I've heard people say that, like, oh, and it's true that people say that going to watch football games is like a drug, right? So, and once you kick the habit, once you break the habit, you don't go back to it. That's true if you're out doing more interesting things. That 50-year-old German guy with this, and I know obviously the situation in Germany isn't as bad, and you haven't had as tough lockdowns as elsewhere because you actually have a functioning health system and people who follow the rules, unlike some countries like the one I live in. But what does the 50-year-old hypothetical man in your do with his sons on weekend? What's he been doing? I presume he's been home watching Netflix or gaming online, and I presume he would rather be doing something else. So I guess what I'm going at is it's not like, maybe I'm just being hopeful here. It's not like these people have stopped watching sports, right? Or taken up different hobbies. I think most of these people have been stuck in their homes watching Netflix or gaming or whatever it is they do. I don't know, playing board games. And I would hope that they're dying to go do something else. I don't think going to football has been substituted by another leisure activity. I genuinely hope not, because I would find that incredibly depressing if that were the case. If it's just like, oh no, let's just stay home and watch Tiger King or whatever.
Yeah, all right. Probably, yeah. I'm not sure what people are doing these days.
Queen's Gambit, right?
We're so less connected to each other.
But look, let's face it. There's no substitute for going to football. Like there's nothing like it. I live in a country in England where they've had this, I think, very stupid 3:00 rule, supposedly to protect attendances. Where there's a blackout, you can't show any football between 3 and 5:15 on Saturdays, 2:45 and 5:15. Where the idea that if I put Barcelona Sevilla on television, people are going to watch that instead of going to watch Altrincham against Rochdale or whatever the hell. And I was like, that's nonsense. One thing is not a substitute for another thing. Going to watch a team going to watch football in person, whether it's your team or something else, is not a substitute for watching it on television. So, going back to your friend in the car dealership, what would be scary is if he thinks people have stopped being interested in football or in sport in general. That would really scare me. That they've substituted television perhaps for going to football matches. Maybe I'm optimistic, but I feel less worried. I just don't think one is a substitute for another.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe we can change a little bit the direction now, and I think people who are also optimistic that fans will be still into football in the next decades and over the next decades are those who have pitched the European Super League, and we wanted to talk about that with you because you have written about the plans for the European Super League, and it's also there's the kind of top versus bottom element, or maybe what you could almost call football plutocracy. And there's an element in there with the plans that have been made public a couple of weeks ago. And of course, we wanted to have your take, or that you could give us your take on these plans and what you see as an underlying development maybe that's going on there. Because I don't think it came out of nowhere. But it's still, we just talked about like what's going on at the top, and then what's with the rest, basically. And I guess a Super League, for instance, or some kind of Super League, and these kinds of competitions would, of course, reinforce the status quo of football, and maybe that a status quo that won't be changed anyway. But still, I mean, there's like this element that the top and the clubs at the top, the rich clubs, try to do what they want, and on their terms. So what's your I would say your general take on the European Super League and the plans that have been revealed?
So, as I wrote in my piece, having talked to a ton of people, the general sense, as several said to me, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen now, because clubs are hurting, because you have a really captive audience at home, because you've got the national match calendar expiring in 2024, because there is a belief that maybe you can do this with FIFA's blessing. So there's no question that there's, I think, a greater appetite for clashes between top clubs on a regular basis, right? That's kind of been the general trend, and I think that's been the success of the Champions League. I think it's also a function of the fact that the big European football brands, as we've seen in recent years, certain clubs have been super dominant, and whereas when you have Paris Saint-Germain playing Bayern, generally, it's more up in the air, right? But when we talk about Super League, and having said that, as we said, a lot of clubs are hurting, and as I was told, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen now. Somebody shows up with a big stack of money and says, I'm a private equity guy, here's some guaranteed money, let's break away and let's do this, and let's form an NFL style or NBA style Super League. Now, if that is your concept of Super League, where teams play home and away, I think you immediately run into several big problems. One obvious problem is that, for those who follow American sports, is if you're the NFL or the NBA, you put your clubs, or you put your franchises in cities with enough of a catchment area, with enough wealth to capitalize on. So what would happen, and the brand itself is slightly secondary. So if I'm going to do that, I might ask myself, well, do I need two teams in Madrid? Do I need two teams in Manchester when there's another super club 20 miles away down the road in Liverpool? Or don't I need a team in Moscow? Don't I need a team in Berlin? How does Berlin not have a super club team, right? Which would be good news for your friend Lars Windhorst, but on the pitch,
my personal friend,
exactly. So that is one big hurdle, right? It kind of runs counter, I think, to some degree, to the interests of those big clubs that you would think would be interested in. The other big thing is, okay, so we have an NFL-style Super League, and it's financially viable. And like the NFL, they say, aha, let's cap wages at 48% of projected revenue, right? Which is what the NFL does. And that way, we're all going to make money every year regardless. Aren't we clever? Well, that's really good news if you're the kind of owner that just wants to have an asset that appreciates in value, that wants to make money every year. So I hate to pick on them, but they lend themselves to it. If I'm Joel Glazer, I'm like, yippee, this is exactly what I want, right? And I'll get even richer doing this. And maybe it applies to FSG at Liverpool as well. But think about the decision makers at Bayern, or at Barcelona, or at Real Madrid, or at Dortmund. Mr. Watzke doesn't get to keep the money if Dortmund suddenly is very, very popular. Neither does Florentino Perez. He's so rich, he probably doesn't need it. So then all of a sudden, I'm not getting personally wealthy. And at the same time, I'm running the risk of finishing mid-table every year in the Super League. So why would I want to be a part of this, right? And I think that's the big counter argument, and it's a very valid counter argument to European Super League. Moving on from all the other arguments about merit, about FIFA could potentially ban everything, about destroying the Champions League. So when I hear these things come up, what I tell myself is, this isn't really what they want. Nobody actually wants this kind of model. because it would run counter to especially German and Spanish super clubs. And then you get into an argument of, can we have one without Spain, without Germany, without the EU's largest economy? And I don't think it's viable. But it serves a purpose to see if, okay, can we get more out of what we want out of the Champions League? It becomes a bargaining chip. And I think that's how UEFA see it. And I think they look at it and they say, could we maybe go and explore like what we've done with EuroLeague basketball, where, the EuroLeague, you've got certain criteria, you get multi-year licenses. Again, it changes, but I think there's 11 teams that are, I think, of 10-year licenses, and some others have 3-year licenses. Some others qualify on merit, and they've kind of, and that's been very successful for basketball in Europe. And basketball is Europe's second biggest sport. However, still, and I think rightly so, UEFA still views this a little bit as idle talk, a little bit as a threat and nothing more. And I think where UEFA is in a pretty strong position is they look at it and say, well, right now, so many teams are hurting that they'll listen to anything, right? If I show up pretending I'm a sheikh, representing Saudi Arabia's Vision Fund, Joe Glazer will listen to me, and I will have an hour with him, and I can outline whatever I want. And I think that is the big difference in the current climate, and I think why more people are taking this more seriously than they did in the past.
Yeah, the interesting thing that you when you were writing about this, and some of the things that I was reading about what you wrote is how it's almost like the Champions League already does some of these things, right? I'm gonna date myself as well. Now that you brought up earlier a thing that showed your age, but I remember Berlusconi in the 90s, because I was Milan fan, and the whole time this is his thing, right? It's he remember signing Jean-Pierre Papin so he can just field a different team in the league and in the Champions League, and people thought that would be normal, right? And that hasn't changed, right? So it's to me, this has always been the bluffing card, or the ace up the sleeve, or whatever card metaphor we want to use for these big clubs, that they eventually just kind of tell UEFA, okay, we're going to form a Super League, and then you get their way, right? But I probably agree with you in the sense that the UEFA can just alter the Champions League format. And I think they already have, right? There's all of the automatic 4 spots and expanding the Champions League, and you can just kind of make that. And I think in that sense that the coronavirus is a great opportunity, because what we saw, even just the altered format of the knockouts last, I guess, August, right? That was at least commercially or ratings wise, it was a huge success of just playing those one single elimination game matches, because you all kind of introduce more randomness, and you can see the Leipzig runs, and even the teams like PSG or Lyon. And Lyon is probably even a better example. But so it could just be that, right? And I think you also mentioned that there's so many different variables of why the Super League could not be feasible, just different outcomes for people. You basically, some people just want to own a football club like they want to own a painting, right? They don't do it because it's just nice to have, right? And sometimes it's a function of soft power, right? It's what a country wants to do it for advertising, right? So there's a lot of different reasons, and I think in that sense you cannot really impose something which tells them why you should own a football club, and generally they should just be allowed to do whatever they wanted. So I think. Then I think you also wrote in your piece that the other thing that you would have needed is some sort of credible saying by a big club, so not Bartomeu out the door as he's mic dropping his Barcelona's doing the Super League, and it doesn't seem like there's been much of that. It's always just these kind of wink, hint. Sometimes Karl-Heinz Rummenigge will say something, and they'll meet, and then or Florentino Perez will just leak something, but it doesn't seem like, because as you mentioned, there's obviously a lot of good about playing those big matches, but at the same time, is it fun to, let's say, like play each of these teams like 4 times? And I think like we had the El Clasico like 4 times in, was it 2011 season? And I think by the third time was Mourinho, Guardiola. Like everybody was just like, really, like it's so there's some elements of that as well. And I'm not sure.
Mourinho is by nature very exhausting.
No, that's true. Yeah, maybe if it was
5 times actually in 2011.
Oh yeah, right.
But yeah, now that said, look, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 5 to 10 years, it happens in other confederations. I wouldn't be surprised if CONCACAF Major League Soccer merges with Liga MX to create, a de facto Super League, with involving the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Gianni Infantino has hinted that maybe that would be a good driver for Africa. If you had a Pan-African Super League, maybe they could do a better job of hanging on to it would be easier for them to hang on to their talents, for example. Maybe we could help the game grow commercially. I always make this point about the women's game too, right? It's not written in stone that football around the world has to necessarily develop the way it has developed in Europe and in South America. The sort of the first 2 countries to really grow the game. Maybe what's right for Europe and South America isn't right in other parts of the world. Maybe there's a better way, or right for the women's game, come to think of it, So I think we need to maintain an openness to it. But when it comes to the European Super League, and, we've seen some of the operators involved, this isn't about growing the game. This is about, assuring your dominance, assuring that the huge built-in advantage you have over other clubs remains the same, assuring you can triangulate on the tensions between UEFA and FIFA to cut yourself a better deal for you and your football club. And I think it's as simple as that.
I mean, that brings up, I think, another topic that was, I think somewhat loosely connected to the European Super League, maybe just because of timing. But there was the project Big Picture in England, where I think we had somewhat of the same thinking behind what was proposed, was that, and it wasn't necessarily about making the game more entertaining. I mean, it was more about, all right, we have a governance in place, and we as like the major clubs, we want to make sure that we will stay there where we are right now. And I mean, obviously these plans fall through, but that was like the timing issue, right? Or the timing thing that then the European Super League was came up. There was revealed shortly thereafter, after the vote was taken on the Big Picture. But I guess I know what you make of it, but is it also? But to me, it's at least somewhat surprising that like some of these concepts that have been brought forward to the public that are very, it's very obvious and very transparent what the big clubs try to do, but they don't feel like there's any kind of either political backlash. And political, that can be like really like legislative backlash, policy making backlash, but also not really backlash from fans that they say, well, that's we don't want that, and even we as like fans of club X, Y, and Z, we don't want that. So what do you make of that? That like these clubs can just like Karl-Heinz Rummenigge or maybe Liverpool and Man United in England, they can just go out there and like propose these plans and don't fear any sort of backlash.
So, well, look, I think a lot of it has to do with the cultural context, right? In Britain, they went through Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, whichever way whether you liked her or not, I think that nobody's going to deny that brought with it a big change. This is somebody who made the point that there's no such thing as society. There's just individuals, right? And that's created a situation where football fans in English grounds are their customers, right? In the same way that, when you go down to, your local supermarket, you're not a fan of the supermarket. You go there, you might like the supermarket. But the supermarket caters to you as long as you're there buying stuff, right? You don't have any kind of ownership or, even metaphorically, of the supermarket. You're purely customer. And if you don't like the way the supermarket works, you'll go to another supermarket if there is one nearby, that is kind of the attitude. That's why fan groups in England, certainly relative to Germany, but not just Germany, relative to Italy, there's no organized ultras movement here. There's no, obviously, again, the model in Germany is different where it varies from club to club about fan representative. You don't have organized fan groups, not to the same degree. Look at Newcastle, where you have all these passionate fans, and yet they're still stuck with Mike Ashley. The one exception you might make in England is obviously what happened at Liverpool when they removed or they helped remove the previous ownership groups of Hicks and Gillette. But that's really, really rare. And I think also increasingly the sort of the direct action by fans matters less and less, because increasingly, if I'm Manchester United, yes, I value the 70,000 who come to Old Trafford and whatever. And by the way, we saw it there as well, right? Remember the green and gold and the Red Knights or whatever they were called, and all those anti-Glazer protests. What happened? A bunch of fans left and formed FC United of Manchester, and David Beckham held up a green and gold scarf, and nobody likes the Glazers, but the Glazers don't care if you like them or not. They just care that you continue to support United. And all those fans around the world who follow United, they're removed by it. They don't many of them don't necessarily care, and it's reflected in United's numbers, which remain really, really good. So I think that is a big part of it. There was a general public outcry against this, against what Liverpool and United were doing. I think part of the reason that it didn't get further was that, the natural opposition was obviously the mid to small size Premier League clubs and the big championship clubs, right? Those were the ones who were probably most opposed to it. Everybody else, many of the clubs in the football leagues that are just desperate are saying, oh, look, free money for life. Yeah, I'll take it, right? But I also wonder, clubs like City, like Chelsea, like Spurs, when they saw this, they're kind of wondering, okay, well, sure, if we change some of these rules and down the road we change the distribution, maybe we'll get twice as much money, maybe 5 times as much money. But then Manchester United will get 20 times as much money, and Liverpool will get 10 times as much money, because those are objectively bigger brands. And they know that. So once you open that Pandora's box of weighting heavier to the bigger brands, there's going to be one brand that's bigger than everybody else. And in England, it's 2 brands that are bigger than everybody else. In fact, objectively, United is much bigger than Liverpool even, right? So then I think they take a step back and say, guys, are we sure we want to do this? Are we sure that, we're not going to become, we'll grow, but the other guys will grow 10 times as much. And I think that was part of it, and that was part of the reason that it came up short.
Yeah, I mean, the question that I want to ask you, and sort of knowing some of the answers to it in terms of project big picture, that there was, at least on a governmental level, some opposition to it. I think Boris Johnson came out against it, which is just strange. But and then the question I want to ask is there a time, do you see some sort of a breaking point when governments will intervene, or is there no recourse for them? I know you have written a lot about, and you seem to you seem to say that FIFA needs to get involved at some level, even when it comes to the Super League you mentioned, but even just in terms of these kind of to mitigate the situation and right, like that. That's I'm not sure how that would happen, just in terms of whether governments can even do that. Can you just maybe give your thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm not a lawyer. When I talk about FIFA getting involved, the kind of extreme closed Super League that we were talking about can only happen if FIFA give their blessing, right? And there are some conspiracy theorists that theorize, oh, look, yes, we'll have a European Super League, we'll have the African Super League I talked about before, and CONCACAF. It's not hard to do one in South American. And then the winners will all play in the FIFA, in an expanded FIFA Club World Cup. So FIFA's on board. If FIFA doesn't say, okay, fine, let's do this, then you have a situation where all these clubs will be barred from playing in their domestic leagues. All these players will be barred from playing in the World Cup. They can make it extremely difficult for these clubs to then transfer to, back into the football system, transfer to other clubs. So, we're talking about going rogue and going totally breakaway, right? In terms of governance and getting involved in something like, the regulation of how you divide up the TV money, how you structure your football pyramid. And I'm not a lawyer here, but governments could pass laws. And in fact, they have passed laws. One of the reasons, for example, here in England on the television side is, there are laws that say that, one broadcaster can't have a monopoly. In Italy, for example, the law on the distribution of television rights and collective bargaining and the collective sale of TV rights rather than individual sale of TV rights, that's codified in law. I think in Spain as well. I'm pretty sure in Germany, where you're having a lot of laws, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a law there too governing that. So governments at some point can get involved. They have to be careful though, because equally, government getting directly involved without the blessing of UEFA and FIFA, UEFA and FIFA could say, well, this is political interference, right? And we've seen that happen in some countries, and most recently Trinidad. In the past, it's been Iran. But, FAs do occasionally get suspended if they allow government to quote unquote interfere. I think in this case, in the case of Project Big Picture, if it had gone forward, I think they could have turned around and said, well, hang on a second, Mr. Government, you're saying you don't like this setup, but here, look, we're backed by the 6 biggest clubs in the country representing, 30-40% of the fans. And because we have this provision to support all these football league clubs, well, out of 72 football league clubs, we have 60 of the 72, right? Including all the little guys in League One and League Two. They're all in favor of it. So how can you come to us and accuse us of, and it would have been a very, I don't know that the government could have, it would be pretty drastic, and government here likes to be pretty laissez-faire on certain issues. So I think it would have been very difficult for the government to step in.
Right. I mean, I think that it sounds like a last resort in a way, right? Like when you're not in favor of some of these plans, that then you like the last idea you have is like basically, all right, that the government has to do something.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think in general the attitude towards governments is, look, if you think about the Premier League, you have 20 clubs, you have I think 14 foreign owners, something like that. And by the way, those big six clubs. Not a coincidence. 5 of them have foreign owners, and the 6th one, Tottenham, the guy's English, but he's a tax exile who's been living in the Bahamas for the last 30 years. So I think we can safely consider him not just foreign, but also somebody who clearly doesn't feel the need to give back to the British government in terms of taxes. So put these things together, I don't know how much they would have cared. And the risk when governments get involved and regulate things in business and in life is that, all of a sudden, Mr. Abramovich, Mr. Mansour, Mr. Glazer say, you know what? You keep coming and messing with my business. Well, maybe I'll go and invest somewhere else. Maybe I'll find a more business-friendly environment to go and spend my money. And, that's always been the counter-argument that people would put forward.
Absolutely. Gabriele, it was really great talking to you. Maybe we can pick up on that at another point in time. Maybe when there are a number of developments in in European and world football, because you, of course, have so much knowledge about all these topics we have now discussed for the past hour. So thank you for your time.
No, it's my pleasure, boys. Thank you for having me on.
Great. Gabriele, you're at Marcotti on Twitter. Abel is at BundesPL on Twitter. I'm CC_Eckner on Twitter. If you want to support us, please visit patreon.com/thefootballpod. And for now, we are out.